Big Seance Podcast, Episode 106. Dr. Scott J. Kolbaba.
I went through probably 200 doctors doing this process. And the stories that I included, I heard lots of stories. I heard probably hundreds of stories. But the stories that I included had to give me goosebumps or make me cry out of emotion. And if I sat there in the morning listening to this story and I had tears in my eyes, I knew that was a good story.
Wow.
And so that's how I boiled it down to about 25, 26 stories that I decided to include in the book.
What looked like a puff of smoke came out of her head, and she took it as the spirit leaving. How many times do you hear about that happening?
Welcome to the Big Seance Podcast. I'm Patrick Keller of BigSeance.com, and this is a place for an open discussion on all things paranormal, but specifically topics like ghosts and hauntings, paranormal research, spirit communication, psychics and mediums, and life after death. So basically, anything that pops up in my paranormal world. The candles are already lit, so you might as well come on in and join the seance.
Fall weather has finally hit Missouri. Tomorrow could be completely different, but this evening is perfectly crispy. Leaves are dancing across the pavement, and you can imagine seeing cackling witches flying through the heavy clouds in the night sky. If you're a member of our Big Seance Parlor group on Facebook, you know I've been decorating for Halloween. And there's a little bonus occasion coming up that's requiring things to be just perfectly spooky here. I'm happy to tell you that behind the scenes, here, while you weren't looking, I got married to my partner, Joe. We've been together for 9 years, and I couldn't be happier. He's so very supportive, and sometimes even plays a role behind the scenes. Well, very soon we have an exciting celebration coming up for our immediate families and closest friends, and you'll be happy to know that it is Halloween themed. I'm trying hard not to get carried away with the spooky, but I'm not sure I'm succeeding. Anyway, I want to thank the many people who have given me nice words of congratulations and support in the parlor. I really appreciate that. I hope you're enjoying your October, no matter the season or the weather. Well, get your tea poured, because I'd like you to welcome Dr. Scott J. Kolbaba to the parlor. He's the author of Physicians' Untold Stories, Miraculous Experiences Doctors Are Hesitant to Share with Their Patients or Anyone. Dr. Kolbaba is an internist in private practice in Wheaton, Illinois. He graduated from the University of Illinois College of Medicine with honors and did his residency at Rush Presbyterian St. Luke's Medical Center in Chicago and at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. He's been awarded membership in the Alpha Omega Alpha Honor Medical Society and has been featured in Chicago Magazine as a top doctor in internal medicine. Being an only child, he now has a family of 7 children. His other passions include his Newfoundland puppy, already 130 pounds, and flying kites. That part cracks me up. I love that. He has also grown Atlantic giant pumpkins and is the proud winner of the Sycamore, Illinois Pumpkin Growing Contest 2 years running. And I know he loves October, and I love October. We just mentioned that before we recorded, so that's a perfect hobby for that. Like many of his friends, Dr. Kolbaba considers himself a card-carrying do-gooder. His family helps support an orphanage in Romania, supervised by REMM, which is Romanian Evangelical Medical Mission, where they adopted 2 of their children. His ultimate goal is to provide enough support to help many more orphans and street children. And we're here to talk today about his book, which is titled Physicians' Untold Stories, miraculous experiences doctors are hesitant to share with their patients or anyone. And I had a chance to read this book. I finished it a couple of weeks ago, and I loved it. His website is physiciansuntolledstories.com. Welcome to the Big Seance Parlor, Dr. Kolbaba.
Thanks, Patrick. It's great to be here.
I have to open with this so listeners know. I have a Facebook group for listeners of the podcast. It's the Big Seance Parlor on Facebook. And, occasionally I'll let people know who I'm getting ready to interview and ask if they have any questions that they're curious about. And sometimes a few people will submit a question, and sometimes I don't get any response. Well, I shared Dr. Kolbaba's book cover, I think the Amazon link, and I let them know that I was interviewing him today. And the questions just kept pouring in. Maybe other than a Ouija seance that we had like a year ago, I think it's actually the most response I've had with questions. So they've actually kind of done all the prep work for me today. So it made it easy, and people are clearly interested in this topic.
That's great.
So can you first just talk to us about the process that you went through to find people in your profession who were willing to talk about this, and how long did that take?
Well, first of all, doctors never talk about this stuff. This is kind of a taboo because no doctor wants to feel like he's strange or like he's had a dream or something that led him to a diagnosis, or that he saw a vision or an angel or something. That would be, the doctors that I'm hanging out with here are pretty ordinary, normal doctors that have regular practices that they don't want to sacrifice. And I think the thinking is that if you come out with a story, like some of the stories that I was able to collect, that your practice will suffer because people will think you're a strange doctor. Well, fortunately, it didn't turn out that way. And I was actually very surprised that the doctors came forward with some of these stories. And how it started, Patrick, was that I had a few strange experiences myself with things that I just couldn't explain. And I thought, boy, this is a little, I don't know, I've never had anything like this happen before. And on the heels of that, then a doctor came up to me on the ward, the hospital ward, and grabbed me by the arm and said, "Scott, I've got this incredible story I want to tell you." I said, "Well, go ahead and tell it to me." This is Dave Mokel, my friend, orthopedic surgeon. And he said, "Well, I can't tell it to you here." And I said, "Well, why not, Dave?" And he said, "Well, somebody might hear me." So I said, "Okay, let's go into empty patient room. We close the door." And he told me an amazing story about a near-death experience with a patient of his that arrested on the operating room table. And while she was basically clinically dead, she said she rose up to the top of the room and was able to visualize everything that had happened, including Dr. Mokel pushing one of the aides with red hair aside because he wasn't doing CPR adequately enough. And while she was there, she said that she was able to see her long-deceased grandmother, who came to her and told her that she would have a special place for her in heaven if she was good and kind. And before this, Mary, who was a patient that had arrested, was kind of a curmudgeon. She was the kind of a person you'd never wanted to see in the office. She'd never had anything good to say. You always did something wrong. And afterwards, she was the most kind and considerate person. So when she told him about this experience after she had come to, and a couple days later, Dr. Mokel just didn't know what to say. He'd never experienced anything like this before. And I said, "Dave, who did you tell this story to?" And he said, "Well, no one. I just told it to my wife, and you're the first person I've ever told it to." So doctors don't tell these kinds of things very readily. So his was the first story that I collected, and I thought this was an amazing story. And then after that, there was another story that just came to me. I think out of coincidence, your viewers will probably realize that these coincidences probably weren't coincidental at all. I was kind of led down the rosy path here to write a book. And so a couple of my experiences, a couple of doctor experiences, and then I thought, boy, these are really moving stories. I wonder if it would make a good book. And so I happened to be looking at Ben Carson's website because I thought Ben Carson would be a great person to get a story from. And on his website, just out of coincidence, there was a picture of Scott McDonald, who was my patient. I thought, why is Scott McDonald on Ben Carson's website? What a coincidence again. And Scott McDonald's a publisher. He published Ben Carson's books. He's a president of a publishing house. So I called Scott and I said, "Can we meet for lunch? I've got a few stories that doctors have told me. I don't know if they're worth anything, but I'd like you to maybe, you're an expert, you're a publisher, listen to these stories and see what you think." So we had lunch, and I was really hungry and eating quickly, and he was listening to the stories, and all of a sudden, I realized he had stopped eating. And I thought, well, that's kind of strange. So I looked up, and he had tears in his eyes. And that's when I realized that these were moving stories. And he said, you have to publish this book. You have to get more stories. So getting back to your original question, Patrick, how did I get other stories? Then I decided to hang out in the doctor's lounge early in the morning. The doctor's lounge has wonderful things like donuts and coffee that all the doctors like to come and get there in the morning. And there is some fruit and good stuff there, too, which is mostly ignored. And so I'd ask the doctor, any doctor coming through, hey, do you have any stories? I'm doing a book. So I committed myself to doing a book. I said, I'm going to do a book, so I wouldn't back out. And I'd embarrass myself if I decided not to. And so I'd say to the doctor, do you have any stories that you can't explain medically? And lots of doctors did. I was surprised that they actually told them to me. And after they did, I'd say, well, let me jot some notes down, but give me your phone number. I'll call you tonight or tomorrow night or whenever, and then we'll get the details of the story. I went through probably 200 doctors doing this process. And the stories that I included, I heard lots of stories. I heard probably hundreds of stories, but the stories that I included had to give me goosebumps or make me cry out of emotion. And if I sat there in the morning listening to this story and I had tears in my eyes, I knew that was a good story.
Wow.
And so that's how I boiled it down to about 25, 26 stories that I decided to include in the book. And this process was supposed to take about 6 months. Well, after 4 years of struggling and writing, I finally got the book out. But it took me a long time to get this done. But lots of funny coincidences, lots of strange coincidences happened along the way, like those with the book publisher, and doctors just happened to come to me with some stories. So that's a long answer to a short question.
No, that's great. When did the first kind of synchronistic events start happening? You talked about your first events, and then you started hearing how early in your career was that?
Well, that was just in the last 5 or 6 years when I started to write this book. So, although in retrospect, everyone, when you look in retrospect at your life, you'll realize that there are some coincidences and synchronicities that happen in everyone's life that if you really think about it, that didn't make any sense. That was so coincidental that it defies the odds that would happen. I've got a story about that if you want me to tell it.
Yeah.
This is a story before I was a doctor, before I got into medical school. And I always thought this was a great coincidence that this happened to me. But now that I've written this book, and in retrospect, I realized this was not a coincidence at all. This was something that was really moving and very strange, and that allowed me to get into medical school. And what happened, I'd been an economics major in college. I always wanted to be a doc, and then I changed to economics in college because I was taking some courses that I thought were really boring, and I thought that was what medical school was going to be all about, but it really wasn't. So I changed to economics. And I graduated. I thought, this is great. I never liked school, so I thought I'd never have to go to school again. I graduated economics. I got a job. But then after about 6 months or so, I realized I really made the big mistake of my life. I need to go back to school. I want to be a doctor. I want to do some good in the world if I can. And so I had to take night courses because I didn't have the prerequisites being an economics major. So one of the prerequisites was organic chemistry, which is a killer course. And it only was offered in 2 places in Chicagoland area at this particular time. And I needed to get in. I'd been fooling around for a couple of years trying to decide what to do. And I realized I had a family already, and I needed to support my family. So I gave myself 1 more year. If I had to get into organic chemistry that particular year, otherwise I'd have to give up my goals and then get a regular job and be a regular person. And
who wants to do that?
No, I don't. I wanted to be the strange doctor that writes books. So it was very wonderful because the course was offered in the same town that I was working in. So I could just walk across the street essentially and go to this university, Aurora University. So it was great. And I went to the bookstore and bought a book, and there were seemed like hundreds of books falling off the shelf. There were so many books. And I thought, this is great. This is going to be a big class. I went to the class the first night, and there were 3 students there. This is even better because now I'll get personal attention from the professor. The professor walked in, didn't even sit down, and said, "I'm sorry, we're canceling the class. There aren't enough students." My heart sunk. My career was over. I wasn't going to be a doctor, and I realized that I had to do something. So I then remembered that the other school offering organic chemistry was Roosevelt University, downtown Chicago, 70 miles away. But I thought, I've got to do this. I really want to be a doctor, so I'll go 70 miles to this class, and I'll take the class. So the next day, I drove down to Roosevelt University to enroll in the organic chemistry. And so I was waiting in line, and I got to the head of the line with the registrar, and I said, I'd like to enroll in organic chemistry. And she said, I'm very, very sorry. And I said, well, why? She said, we have a full class. We opened up a second class that's now full, and we have 10 students in the waiting list. And I said, well, you don't understand. I'll be a failure in life if I don't get organic chemistry because I won't be a doctor, and so forth. I'll have to be a regular person again. And she said, I'm sorry that all the 10 students that are on the waiting list have the same story, a sad story that you do. And I said, well, I'm desperate. What can I do? And who can I talk to that makes the final decision? And she said, well, the professor makes the final decision about who gets into the class. So I said, well, where does the professor hang out? I need to talk with him and see what he can do. And she said, well, he's upstairs on the third floor. Okay. So I ran upstairs, stumbling half the way, got to a room that was full of students with the same intention that I had to try to get into the class. And so I must have looked like the worst sad sap in the world to the secretary. And I said, if I can just have 30 seconds of the professor's time, that's all I need. And she said, okay, you go to the ante-room, which is right outside the professor's door. And as I was walking there, everyone gave me a dirty look because they were waiting to see the professor too. And I happened to sit down right outside the professor's door. And the two professors were in there actually talking about the class, their organic chemistry class, because there were two professors, one teaching the old class and one teaching the new one. The door was paper thin, and I could hear right through the door. And they were saying, I don't know what we're going to do. It's a desperate situation. I'm thinking, what's a desperate situation? One professor said, we have no books. We have enough books for the first class, but no books for the second class. And if the class starts tomorrow, I don't know what we're going to do. And this is before computerization and computer books and so forth. And so they talked for a while. They called the publisher. They'd called all the universities in the area. No one had any books. So the one professor shook hands and they left, and the other professor signaled for me to come in and talk with him. And he looked very bored. And I said, I'm desperate. I need to get into organic chemistry, otherwise I'll be a failure in life and so forth. He said, I'm sorry, we've got a full class, a new class, and 10 students just like you. I'm sorry we can't help you. He shook my hand and saw me out. And about the time I was walking out the door, I got this flash that I needed to do something desperate. These were desperate times. My career was on the line. I needed to be a doctor, and if I couldn't take organic chemistry, I'd have to get a regular job, and I wouldn't become a doctor. So I said to him, I understand you have a problem with books. If I can get you books, will you let me in the class? And my heart was beating really hard. And all of a sudden, his eyebrows went up, and I could tell he was paying attention to me at this time. And there was a long silence, and he must have been thinking. And then he said to me, can you get 30? And my heart went up to my throat and was pounding really hard. And I said, more. And then there was a long silence again. And I'm standing there, with the sweat dripping off, my medical career on the line. And he says, you're in. I told him where to get the books. I got into organic chemistry. And I thought afterwards, what a great coincidence that I happened to be outside the door with the professors where only I could help them and only they could help me. And what are the odds that I would happen to show up right at that very minute? They're almost infinitesimal. And so I thought, as I wrote this book, this was a synchronicity, a coincidence that couldn't be explained except for the hand of God. And I think if people look back at their lives, frequently these kinds of things in retrospect, you will see in everyone's life. I think everyone has a coincidence, or they happen to meet someone on the elevator that just happened to have them interview with someone where they got a job or whatever. I'm sure you've had that kind of synchronicity or coincidence too. And so that was one of the first times that I realized that there was something else happening here. But I didn't realize it until I started writing. And then I realized all these unusual coincidences in my life that led me to do what I'm doing that many people have.
So it's definitely a journey that you were meant to be on, you feel?
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so. There were so many unusual things that happened that I think lots of people are on a journey in life. And when they look back at something that's worthwhile to do, they were helped by some unusual circumstance or whatever. Steve Jobs. Have you heard Steve Jobs' speech in Stanford?
I think so. I've heard one of them. I'm assuming that's what it was.
That's the one where he dropped out of college, and he went to an expensive college. His parents couldn't afford it, and he decided to drop out because he wasn't getting anything. And then he said, when I dropped out, I was able to take the classes that I wouldn't have taken had I been paying for them. So I audited all these unusual classes that I just loved, like calligraphy and typesetting and things like that. And he realized later, when he was designing the Macintosh, that had he not gone to these classes that taught him about typesetting and about fonts and about the art of typing and of printing, that he wouldn't have designed such a beautiful computer. And he's convinced, I don't know what he believed, but he's convinced that something, some force, something, I don't think he even called it God, but he believed that something helped him to get to that place. And in retrospect, he realized why he took those classes, because those helped him. And I think everyone has those kinds of things.
It's kind of random, but it also fits as I'm sitting here talking to a doctor, and I was born with pretty severe congenital scoliosis and had surgeries and things as a 12, 13-year-old kid. And so I often, my parents my whole life were pushing and encouraging to do everything, to get me. They didn't ever want me to feel like there were things that I couldn't do. But it makes me wonder if that's what set me on certain journeys and certain passions that I have now and led me to certain things that I do, on this path. Not that I ever imagined myself playing professional football or anything, because I wouldn't even be interested in it at this point in my life, but it makes me wonder those things, synchronicity, even from the womb.
I'm sure it was. I'm sure there are things that happen that you just can't explain. That move you along in a path that is for your good.
Do you ever get criticism or eye rolls from your peers?
I thought I would. I thought I'd get lots of criticism, because these stories are really strange. These stories are ghosts and premonitions and dreams, and I just included, I didn't have, there was no specific selection of the stories. The stories that moved me and touched my heart were the ones I included. So there are a whole host of all kinds of things. And I thought, I'm going to get all kinds of criticism. My patients are going to stop seeing me because they think I'm going to be a strange person. And I thought the doctors, too, would get that. I was afraid for the doctors. But the thing that happened was so unusual. We had a launch. We launched the book about a year ago. And at the launch, lots of the doctors showed up. And the response from the people that were there, my patients, their patients, people from the community, was incredible. It was so positive. And I think it was. I thought about this because I thought we're going to get all kinds of criticism for this kind of thing and eyes rolling and so forth. There was none of that. Everyone was so positive. They were saying, thank you for coming out with these stories, because now I feel that the story that I have, I can tell without feeling embarrassment. And I think what happened is that everyone has stories. Every family or every individual has an unusual circumstance in their life. And I think this book and these stories have allowed them permission to tell their story. Because if these doctors can tell these unusual stories, maybe my story is valid too, and maybe it's okay for me to tell it. And I've heard lots of stories from my patients and from lots of people. Honestly, Patrick, I've had no criticism at all, and that shocks me. I would think I'd have all kinds of criticism, but I had none. The doctors that have shared these stories have had nothing but praise, and it's really gratifying to see that. So I was wrong. I thought I'd be defending myself against all kinds of slings and arrows, but that hasn't happened.
Do you think that maybe we're just finally getting to a time where this overly critical, scientific, skeptical barrier is kind of being lifted? Do you think the tides are turning a little bit?
I think it is. I think people are more open to things that you can't explain. The divine, whatever you want to call it. And I wasn't very preachy at all with the book. I just told stories. And so I didn't tell people what it is that was happening here. I just let them decide for themselves what it was. But I think the tide is turning. I think people are realizing there is something else out there, and that if you believe in God, that there is a God that helps us and loves us unconditionally and directs our path, and that people that have passed on really can know what we're doing in our life and sometimes intervene in unusual and strange ways in certain circumstances.
You were talking about some of the stories, and the ones that moved me the most, I realized, were like you had several international stories where there were doctors that went to communities in need, including the Philippines and Ethiopia. And
yes,
some of those really touched me, especially now with hurricanes affecting communities and what we're seeing in that light in the news and everything, and
Sure.
and really feeling so much empathy for those folks. And I know that's a little different, but those stories I thought were really, really good and really affected me. Were there any of those that you wanted to share?
Oh, absolutely. What I learned before I shared one of those stories was that I learned a lot about doctors when I interviewed doctors, because doctors are very superficial with each other. We talk about serum potassium levels, and we talk about the next gallbladder we're going to take out, and how someone died, and those kinds of the medical things. But we rarely talk about these kinds of stories, and we also rarely talk about what makes a doctor tick. Why did you go into medicine, and what wakes you up in the morning and makes you get out of bed and gives you the juice that makes your day go along. And so after talking with a lot of these doctors, I realized that most doctors are what I coined a term, sappy do-gooders. So I thought most doctors are just sappy do-gooders. They want to do good in the world. They want to cure cancer. They want to help someone every single day. And so it's not unusual for doctors to go on medical missions and to help people. The one particular story is about Mike Hussey as a gynecologist. He actually delivered my fourth son, Ian, and Ian's still up talking and walking, so he did a good job delivering him. And so Mike is a believer that he was given a gift to be able to become a doctor, and he feels that he needs to share that gift as much as he can. So every year he goes on a medical mission. And he's a gynecologist, so he does surgeries. And the group that sends him out tries to send these doctors, they all get together, to a place that is the poorest of the poor. And the one place that they went to this particular year was the Philippines. And they went to one of the outer islands of the Philippines where there was a tiny little hospital of 8 beds. And he was operating at that hospital. And there were no nurses. There were just some techs that helped him out with this surgery. And the instruments he used were instruments that they had and some of the ones he brought, which were from the 60s. But they were still instruments that would work. They're just not quite as sophisticated as what we have.
And he was the only doctor there, correct?
He was the only doctor there at that particular hospital at this time. There were a couple other doctors that were in and out, and there were about 30 doctors that went on the trip, but they all went to different hospitals in different locations. So he was there at this little hospital, and when the doctors come, the patients, the Philippine people, line up for blocks to see these doctors because they know that they can't afford to have any surgeries by themselves. So the only way they can get surgery is to have these American doctors do surgery, because once they go, they're stuck for the rest of the year. So this one particular woman had she looked like she was pregnant. She had some tumors in her uterus, but they didn't have any equipment to diagnose what she had, so they just knew she had a very large uterus for the last couple of years, and Dr. Hussey decided to operate on her to remove this because it was very difficult for her to get around with this very large tumor in her abdomen. So he started to operate on her, and in the operating room, it's not uncommon that the lights go out. They just move the operating table over to the window where they can see, and they were doing that back and forth. And when he got in, he realized that this was a very difficult case because the uterus was all matted down with scar tissue. Over the years, scar tissue had grown in. And normally what you do, evidently, I'm not a surgeon, but what Dr. Hussey told me is they lift the uterus up, tie off the blood vessels underneath the uterus so that they can stop the bleeding, and then they finish the surgery. Well, this particular case, they had some bleeding, but they couldn't lift the uterus up because it was so matted down. So he found himself with a woman who has her belly open. She's bleeding more and more and more, and he can't stop the bleeding. Well, he wanted to, normally you'd call to the blood bank, send me a couple units of old negative blood or whatever. And he couldn't do that because there was no blood bank. The nearest blood bank was 25 miles away. So here he is, a woman's bleeding to death, literally in front of him. Everyone in the operating room becomes silent because in situations like this, no one makes eye contact. Everyone becomes silent because they know this is a life-threatening situation that's happening right in front of them. This is a young lady that they're going to lose, that she's going to die. And she's bleeding more and more, and he can't stop the bleeding. He can't cauterize enough blood vessels. He can't lift the uterus up. And so he becomes so desperate that he reaches for the only thing that he can do, and that is he closes his eyes, he folds his hands, and he says a prayer. Heavenly Father, this is not my patient, it's your patient. You are the master healer. Please take over. He opened his eyes. Everything suddenly was accessible. The uterus was freed up. He was able to lift the uterus up, tie off the blood vessels, the bleeding stopped. He finished the surgery, and she lived. And so afterwards, he obviously was very thankful and said a prayer of thanksgiving. The next day, he saw the woman that he operated on. She was perfectly fine, a little pale from blood loss, but she was fine. And she said that she had said a prayer for him also, thanking him for doing that surgery. So that was something that Dr. Hussey said he would never forget all his life. A little hospital, 8-bed hospital off of nowhere, with no nurses, no blood bank, and only God to call on to help. And he says that he was given help that day.
The stress and the pressure of knowing that it's just you and everybody is looking to you. I can't imagine that at all. That's just, I mean, sometimes I feel a little bit like that when I'm standing in the middle of 60 middle school kids since I'm a teacher.
Yes.
But, it's not life-threatening.
Well, this was something that he knew she was dying, literally, on this. Yeah. And she was a beautiful young girl and a young lady. And he was responsible. He was in charge. And if he lost her, he would be the one that would have to face that the rest of his life. So,
and then no matter what happened, move on to the next patient waiting out in the line. That's crazy.
Yeah, isn't it? Yeah.
So I guess after I bragged about having all these questions submitted to me, I should get to some of these questions.
Okay.
Linda asks, and side note, full disclosure, Linda is my mom. Linda asks, hospitals are supposed to be one of the top places for spirits to be. Have you ever seen or felt a spirit in the hospital?
I don't think I've not seen a spirit in the hospital. Some of the doctors have stories about spirits in the hospital. Lots of the nurses have stories in the ICU about spirits in the hospital. That's not been a thing I've experienced, but I think that you're so close to the hereafter sometimes in the hospital that's where you might experience some spirits. The one story I told about Dr. Mokel and the woman that rose to the top of the room, the spirit of her grandmother came to visit her. And there was another interesting story from Noemi Sigalov, who's a general surgeon, that was taking care of a missionary couple, actually two physicians that were missionaries in Africa. She was taking care of them for a long time. And they were trying to tell her that she needs to become more spiritual and more religious. And finally, one of the last visits that they had, because the woman was cured, and Dr. Sigalov had operated on her, and she was fine, and it was the last visit, the fellow said, I'm going to show you someday that there is life after death, that there is something to the hereafter. And she said, that's fine. That was okay. So a number of years later, Dr. Sigalov was taking a vacation, and she had to be on call the night before. And invariably, when you're on call, something disastrous comes in, and she had to do an emergency surgery in the middle of the night. She finished and then had to make early morning rounds before her flight left for Tucson. And as she's walking to the hospital, there was a puff of air as she opened the doors. You know how sometimes there's a different pressure. And all of a sudden she saw in front of her this missionary, the man that had said to her, I'm going to show you that there is a life hereafter. He was all dressed in white. He didn't say anything. He just simply smiled. And the smile, she said, was that of a person that had accomplished a major missionary goal in his life, that kind of satisfied smile. And she thought that was kind of interesting. And she said, hi there. And she scared herself because she didn't realize that she had actually said something. She looked around to make sure no one saw her because there was no one there. And then this vision disappeared. She went on her rounds, made her plane, got to Tucson, where she shut off all of her phones and emails and so forth for 3 days. And then as she's going back to Chicago, she decided to check her email and all of her messages. And in the email was a message from the vice president of the hospital and said, I'm sorry to inform you that the individual that she had been taking care of, the fellow, had died the morning that she had made rounds. He died at 2:30 a.m., and she made rounds at 4:30. And she was shocked. She got goosebumps all of a sudden to realize that he had died hours before he appeared to her to show her that there was life after death.
I'm just sitting here. We're talking about synchronicities, and you had mentioned a puff of air in that story. And the very next, I highlighted my next question that I was going to ask, and it's from Kathy in the Facebook group. And she says, My mom said when her mom passed, what looked like a puff of smoke came out of her head, and she took it as the spirit leaving. How many times do you hear about that happening?
I've heard that before. I've not seen it. I've not had any doctors mention that to me, but I've heard that before. And after writing this book and getting some of the experiences that I've gotten, I'm not going to discount anything. Mm-hmm. I think lots of unusual things happen. And so I'm not sure what that is. Maybe that is the spirit leaving the body. I don't know. I've not experienced that myself.
I think isn't it Kubler-Ross that talked a lot about experiences with people having the puff of smoke or seeing things coming out of the body?
Yes.
I remember reading that. And then you also said that sometimes in a hospital, you're so close to the hereafter. It makes me wonder if since you're so close, maybe you are seeing things that are spiritual or paranormal all the time. And, there are a lot of people that say people see ghosts all the time. You just don't realize it because you expect it to look like a ghost. And it's so very real.
I think strange things happen to us that we may not realize. And again, some of these coincidental things that happen are very unusual. And when you think back in your life, think back to the coincidences that you've had, not you, but anyone. Mm-hmm. And I think we will realize that there are some things that we overlook that are unusual. Since I've written this book, I'm bumping into all kinds of things that I never realized were as spiritual as they are. And I think the doctors are having the same experience. And I hope other people do too. I hope this book and these stories help other people realize there's something else out there. There is hope. And there is someone that will guide us in the ventures that we're undertaking that are worthwhile ventures.
Karen asks a great question. She says, are the experiences reported to you always positive?
The ones that I had reported to me were always positive. Now, I know there are negative spiritual experiences that people have, but none of the experiences that I had were negative. And it was interesting. I talked with some of the palliative care doctors, and the experiences that they report also when people are dying are universally positive. People get dressed to make connections with, to dress up and to try to look nice because they either see people that they've have gone past before them, or they are anticipating seeing them. And so most of the experiences are incredibly positive. So I've had no negative stories reported to me at all, but I'm sure there are. I know there are.
And maybe those are the people that are unlikely to share them because they feel odd about having such a negative experience. I'm going to take a chance on this one because I'm going to trust this person. Jenalina asks if you've ever seen, when maybe a patient sees someone who's not there or not physical to other people in the room. And she says she knows it's super random, but she has to ask if any of those visitors ever have red hair.
The only red hair that I wrote about that was told to me was the red hair from the tech that was doing CPR on the individual that arrested in the OR. So that one was definitely
the red hair.
And that's the one Dr. Mokel pushed aside. That was so moving when Mary reported to him that she saw him push the guy with the red hair aside and start doing CPR himself, and that's when she started to come back. So that was the red hair person, but I don't think anyone else had red hair that I recall.
I'm curious as to where that question came from. You're encouraging people to send you their stories, and if I have heard the rumor mill correctly, you're considering a second book. So is this invitation for anyone or just medical professionals?
Anyone. I think these stories need to get out. I'd like to write a number of books because if some of the comments I get, Patrick, in letters and emails are, thank you for sharing these stories. These have given me a new hope. I realize now that I will see my mother again, or that even though I've got a serious illness, that someone loves me and is looking out for me. So I think if I can make one or two people have a little more happiness in this life and feel a little more peace, it's worth it. So I'm going to be writing, hopefully, a number of books. I'd like to write one about nurses, and then just ordinary individuals that have unusual experiences. I'm hearing all kinds of stories now after writing the book. People feel comfortable coming out with stories and telling me their stories, which is great. We're also working on a television series. We did some filming for a trailer last Saturday, and we're going to be there's a big production company in New York that thinks this would make a good television series. So we're working on that too. So that would hopefully will be next year.
Very cool, and good luck with that.
Thank you.
Crystal Hope Reed, who is a previous guest on the show, along the lines of what you were just talking about, she says, I don't have any questions, but I just read the Amazon description of the book, and I'm so happy it's out there. I got kind of teary-eyed thinking about how he might convince some people to open their minds, and she said, thank you, Dr. Kolbaba.
Well, that's very nice of her. I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything. I'd like people to read these stories and see how they feel themselves. So if these stories move them, and when you get closer to the hereafter, when you get closer to God, you get a sense, you get a feeling inside your body that is a warm, comfortable feeling. And if I get people to feel that warm, comfortable feeling, and they feel like they're closer to their Heavenly Father or whatever they believe, that's my goal. And I think we did that for some of the stories. You'll need some Kleenex for some of these stories. They're not sad, but they're moving.
And they suck you in.
I hope they do. Yeah.
So I joke that sometimes this is the most important question that I ask to most of my guests. And I'm curious, outside of the medical profession, what kind of nerd are you? Like, what's your biggest nerd area? I always encourage this with anybody I meet.
Let's see. I consider myself a nerd. And I realize now that in high school, I was a nerd. I belonged to the chess club. I had a pocket protector. I wear wingtip shoes. And so I am definitely a nerd. The kinds of things that I like are things that are not really exciting. I love to go on vacations with my family. I love my kids. I love my grandkids. I love to go fishing with my kids. There's nothing, really exciting. Although I do want to do a kiteboarding. That's one of my passions. I'd like to go kiteboarding. My wife thinks I'll maim myself, but yeah, I'm a bona fide certified nerd, and
well, family nerd is acceptable too. I think that counts.
Good.
Family man nerd.
Yep.
So we mentioned the website, and by the way, you've got some really awesome trailers for the book on your website. Some cool videos that people should check out on there, and maybe they can. There's anything we can do other than buy the book and read it. Maybe sharing some of those trailers for the book would be cool.
That'd be great.
They're very nice. So, other than all of that, how can we find you? And I guess just what do you want to close with today?
You can find me on Amazon. Our website is physiciansuntoldstories.com. And I'd like everyone to know that it's okay to tell these stories, to tell your story, because other people will realize that the stories that they have are okay to tell too. I like people to know that there's something else out there. You can define it however you want. You can call it God or a force or a universe or whatever. I want people to know that this force loves us and looks out for us and helps us in unusual ways, so that if you have something that you're trying to accomplish, be aware that something else will help you accomplish that goal. You may not realize it at the time, but you will realize it in retrospect. I want people to realize that loved ones aren't gone forever, that they are still somewhere, and that they can, in some cases, come back and help us in unusual ways, in strange ways, and in wonderful ways. And that love is the most powerful force in the universe. Love between individuals, between family members, and love between us and our God. And so that's what I'd like people to know.
Dr. Kolbaba, it was an honor to talk to you, and I am so glad that people are excited to hear this one, and I can't wait to share this one. So thanks for what you're doing, man. You rock.
Thanks, Patrick. It's been a pleasure interviewing with you.
For show notes, including links to anything we may have mentioned in this episode, visit bigseance.com. Just click on the Big Seance podcast logo or find it in the menu. You can also find and subscribe to the show in iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, TuneIn Radio, and iHeartRadio. Do you have any comments or feedback? Go to bigseance.com/feedback to learn how to get your voice in a future show. Or you can call my feedback line, 7755-TELL-ME. That's 775-583-5563. Interested in learning how to promote and share the podcast? Go to bigseance.com/share. Thank you so much for listening. Unfortunately, it's time to blow the candles out, but we'll see you and light them again next time. Your Paranerd hashtag for this episode is medical miracles. That's hashtag medical miracles, all one word. On Twitter, you can tag me at Big Seance. Have a spooky day.